Hello, everyone. Welcome to our bi-monthly Bridge Culture Club. Today we're discussing Shadows Beyond the Pines. Today's event is hosted by Bridge, Michigan. Uh, I'm Jackie Garrett, and my colleague Sally Friels is here, and we represent the membership team here at Bridge, Michigan. Thank you all for joining us today. In case you aren't familiar with us, Bridge Michigan is Michigan's nonprofit, nonpartisan news source covering issues that matter to you and your community. You can subscribe for free at www.bridgemi.com. Also, for those of you who are current Bridge Club members, which includes anyone who has donated to Bridge any amount over the last year, those folks get a number of benefits, including access to a free electronic copy of each Bridge Culture Club selection. You can become a member today by visiting the link that we will drop into the chat in just a moment. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by Dianna Cross Toran. I'll give a full introduction of her momentarily. We're just incredibly honored that she was willing to join us for a discussion of her book today. Um, as far as the schedule for today's discussion goes, it will go like this. I'm going to introduce Dianna Cross Toran, and I'm going to lead a discussion with her for about 40 minutes on the book with some questions that our staff has developed. And then, like towards the end, we'll compile reader questions for the author. So for those of you who have questions, they might be burning from the time you've been reading. Maybe you just thought of them now. You can drop those questions into the chat and we'll collect them to spend about the last 15 or 20 minutes asking those questions. And then we will conclude no later than 1 p.m. We will be recording this discussion and it will be posted on Bridge's website, www.bridgemi.com. And now I would like to introduce Dianna Cross Toran. Dianna Cross Toran was born in Lansing, Michigan. Her family has owned a cottage in Woodland Park since 1947, and her father told many stories about his youth at the cottage in Woodland Park. Dianna has always had the cottage in her life and has many great memories with her family and grandparents, and now with her grown children at the cottage. In 2013, she began her research into Woodlands Park's past to fill in the gaps in her father's memory about the people he knew in the early years. That resulted in having many conversations with a man named Stephen Jones, who was the Woodland Park historian at the time. He was also Malcolm X's nephew. He unlocked the well-kept secret of the place she loved the most, and that was that Woodland Park had been a successful Black resort during segregation. This was something even her father hadn't known. Tragically, Stephen died only a year after they connected, and he had been working on a book as well, but it was never published. Thirsty for more knowledge, Dianna began a journey back in time to stories told by the descendants, some who were residents themselves or owned vacation property in Woodland Park or in the nearby communities. And more avenues opened until a larger.
We lost your audio.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was just awful. Thirsty for more knowledge, Dianna began a journey back in time to stories told by the descendants, some who were residents or owned vacation property in Woodland Park or the nearby communities. And more avenues opened until a larger story unfolded. The second book, Shadows Beyond the Pines, was a product of added facts and photographs that were not available during the publishing of the first book. Shadows tells the history of Woodland Park only during segregated years. Dianna still spends as much time as possible at the cottage and is a member of the Woodland Park Lake Association and the Woodland Park Schoolhouse Committee. Dianna currently lives in Cincinnati, Ohio with her family. Again, folks, please feel free to type questions to our special guest here anytime during today's discussion. But with all that being said, I'm going to get us started with our discussion today. So Dianna, our readers are always so interested in folks' personal connection and family history when it relates to books like this. Can you tell us more about your personal family connection to Woodland Park and how that influenced your decision to write this book? And you're on mute, by the way.
Well, you can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay. My father was just 15 when his family visited Woodland Park for the first time. We had relatives who had recently built a cottage that they named Bonnie Castle. People back then named their cottages. They told my great grandmother about it, and it must have sounded like heaven because she decided that she and her grown son and daughter and their families were going to spend a week there. She is a bit bossy, or, well, let's say strong-willed. My dad was really unhappy about it. He was a teenager and he had baseball games that he would miss and a girlfriend that he would miss. But soon after arriving, all that took a back seat. He loved it, and so did the family. They came the following year too, and it was about then they decided to build their own place. In 1947, they built what we continue to visit to this day, our cottage. My dad would often tell me stories about his early years, and around 2013, I thought, someone ought to write this stuff down. And it wasn't long after that I decided that it would be me. And originally, it was only going to be printed out, stapled together, and left at the cottage for the family to read. It was never on my radar to write a book, let alone publish three. But after putting all that together, I wanted to know more about the place our family loved so much. Writing a book still was not on my horizon, but it did plant the seeds to discovery.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And how did growing up knowing or not knowing about your family's ties to Woodland Park shape your understanding of your own identity? And for some of our readers who may not have had a chance to check out the book yet, maybe it might help to tell them where Woodland Park is.
Woodland Park is probably an hour, let's see, maybe an hour and a half north of Grand Rapids, up M37 or 131. Um, and it's off of M37. You take 11 Mile Road to get back in there. Um, the idea of one's own identity is, for me, constantly changing. I grew up a lot during the years of discovery. I feel I'm a better person because of my connection to Woodland Park. I was able to share with so many people a history about these remarkable people who started this haven. And I'm so thankful that my grandmother, Aura, was so persistent that the family went to Woodland Park for the first time, that my grandparents built our place a few years after. Uh, I'm also grateful that my grown children share that same love. So my family ties are very strong to Woodland Park.
Wonderful. Did you ever have a chance to visit as a young person?
Oh, it's been on my life, my whole life. One time recently, me and my daughter were driving to the cottage from Cincinnati. I think it was even last year. And I was telling somebody about how um, Woodland Park had been in my life my whole life, because it's been in our family since my dad was 17.
Mhm.
And my daughter said, well, it's been in my life my whole life too. And I said, oh, I guess it's all relative. So, yes, my very first Thanksgiving as a let's see, I guess it would be an 11-month-old baby, was spent at the cottage.
Wow. And you shared a little bit about this in your bio, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about what initially sparked your interest in researching Black resort communities in Michigan. And during that research, what surprised you most about the scope and sophistication of Woodland Park as a community?
Well, when I found out about Woodland Park being a Black resort, I thought it and Idlewild were the only two in the state of Michigan. But when I widened my research net, I found that it had actually had a few others. Some didn't make it off of the drawing room floor because probably some of the area white communities didn't want that in their communities. But there's one that was called Shaw Lake, and it's over near the Thumb someplace. I haven't been over there to see it, but I know it's there. I've driven through one that is in Angola, Indiana, because it's on our way to the cottage, and it's called Fox Lake Resort. And it was interesting to see see it and know that they went through some of the same things that our community did back in the day. But that's someone else's story to tell, not mine. But I will say this, I have no doubt in my mind that there wouldn't have been a Woodland Park if there hadn't been an Idlewild. One of our long-term residents, Miss Tyson, who's lived most of her life there, who will actually turn 102 this year, said during an interview at our centennial celebration in 2021, this place was a gift from God. And what was the other part of your, oh, you
Yes.
said,
What surprised you most during your research about the scope and sophistication of Woodland Park as a community?
wow, there's so much. The hotels, the immense clubhouse on the very point where my cousins now on a piece of that property have a cottage. And then some of my other friends have cottages. It's called Mayo Point. There's probably uh, a dozen cottages on that point where the clubhouse once stood. Um, and the way Woodland Park provided transportation. I mean, they thought of everything. And the people who visited there, the brothers who wrote the Black National Anthem, Live Every Voice and Sing, they were there. W.E.B. Du Bois, Hallie Q. Brown, who spoke before royalty. Chicago's Mayor Daley was there. Alex Haley visited our corner store to talk to Malcolm X's sister about Malcolm X because he wrote Malcolm X's biography. Joe Morgan, I'm sorry, Joe Lewis, and many other entertainers that entertained in Idlewild stayed in Woodland Park. But mostly I was fascinated about our founders and the settlers who had a vision that made Woodland Park what it is still today.
And following this story was just so inspirational because I was reading it, from the time that the authors had this idea to the time, that it became what it was known for. And there were so many historical facts, like, the fact that it was traditionally very difficult for Black Americans to access capital to even start an enterprise like this. So to be able to build something so substantive and the face of those challenges is just it's really inspirational and worth highlighting.
That's so true because even my father was telling me as recent as probably a few months ago to buy our house in Lansing. He had to get it bought through, first, he had to get a land contract, but it was through somebody white who had to actually do the land contract. And then he
Mhm.
paid them until he was able to get it on his own.
And this like mirrors those earlier stories about woodland parks. So some
Mhm.
things just persist.
Right.
What and so maybe you can tell us a little bit about just talking more about your personal connection to Woodland Park. What was it like to walk through Woodland Park for the first time as a researcher versus as a descendant who's just enjoying this beautiful place?
Um, so I went from being a oh boy, what a journey. From being a vacationer to a researcher to a historian from 2013 to now. From only knowing a few people in Woodland Park, um, not a few, but a smaller group of people, to be known by most of the people in Woodland Park and to be known by strangers who, like you all who've read my book, people who reach out to me about my books because there was some connection made. I don't hold any degrees. I didn't finish college, but I had a true love for this place in Michigan that had an amazing story. Did I make grammar and spelling and errors of all kinds? Yes. But I hope most people overlook those and love the story. I'm proud of being the descendant and prouder still that I didn't let our founders' history die with them.
And how did you track down that history, those stories of families like the authors? As you noted in your book, so much of this history was dispersed through family histories. It may not have been archived as formally as it deserved to have been. So, how did you track down those stories?
That was one of my favorite things about writing the books, talking to so many people who provided stories. We're all a network of life. We have no idea how we may impact someone that we may only meet once or twice. People like my father who remember things like it just happened. Because Ella's wealthy family and her sister's involvement in the black movement back at that time, there were other references in writing about them. I read so much about them and listened to so many stories about them. I feel like I know them. But it was only a couple of years ago in 2022 that Ella's great grandniece, Alexa, reached out to me. She was living in California and ran across my books. Ella's sister, Grace, had remained at the homestead and took care of their mother until her death. They had a German hired hand by the last name of Schmidt who had been with the family for years. He and Grace got married. Grace was so fair that soon, for all intents and purposes, she became white in the senses and in her life. Her family believed that their fortune came from the Schmidt side of the family. They had no idea that their wealth came from Grace's black grandfather, Levi Foster. She, she's embraced her heritage and recently sent me a few pictures of her mother, few pictures that her mother found of Ella's sister, Myrtle, as a young girl, and Ella's father, James.
Wow.
Recently, the 1950 census opened up and new information has been revealed. And as time goes on, who knows what we'll find out? Maybe where Jimmy Hoffa really is. You just don't know. But it was a labor of love. And like I said, talking to so many people, it was like the shampoo commercial. They would have a story and they would say, go talk to this person, and so on and so on and so on until it just kept growing.
Mhm.
So that that was how I was able to get so much information.
It sounds like so much of it was preserved as oral history from people who were living and able to collect those stories. So
Yes.
it sounds like you were so timely in capturing that. The longer you wait with oral histories, the more that's lost.
Oh, yes, because since then, a lot of people in my books who gave me information have passed on.
Hmm.
So I was very blessed. And I did miss some people who would have had even more to tell me because they passed on before I found out about them.
Hmm. You mentioned that many Black families didn't own cameras at the time, so much of the visual history of Woodland Park was probably not captured or preserved, except for what Ella perhaps was collecting. So, how did that challenge affect your research process?
That was a major challenge because always when I started interviewing people, I would say, well, do you have any pictures that you can share? Well, we didn't have a camera back then. That was a luxury. And I'm like, you don't think of it now because in the digital world, you take a picture and you can see it right then and there. But back then, you had to first get a camera. Cameras were kind of pricey. Then you had to buy film. Film was kind of pricey. And then you had to have it developed. And you had to pay for whatever pictures you took. So even the ones that were like of your nostrils while you were pointing the camera in your face, you had to pay for all those. So people didn't own cameras. Um, and you know, I'm such a visual person. If you can't see it, it doesn't feel like it ever existed. So very few of Woodland Park's hotels or churches or businesses have remained. The only thing left of the Grand Royal Breeze Hotel is a huge fireplace that sits out in the yard where it sat within the hotel, and some cement stairs that lead down to the lake. Without Ella's postcards, we wouldn't have any idea what it had looked like. My father often says how he wished that someone had taken pictures when he played ball with the Woodland Park baseball team. There were some taken, but a fire destroyed those. It would have been great to have pictures of many of the people who visited. There were some pictures, but the people were not identified. But every time Ella's postcards pop up, it's like finding gold. And I'm always scouting for that. I Google all the time Woodland Park or Bitely postcards. And sometimes I hit gold. Sometimes, it's postcards I've already have.
Mhm. Yeah, Ella's, the photos that you included in the book were just incredible. Even seeing Joe Lewis later on in the book was just so interesting.
That
Um,
that was actually found in a, a picture that was at a yard sale, a religious picture in a frame. And the lady that bought it, she just bought it because she wanted the frame. She didn't want the religious picture. She wanted to use the frame. And when she pulled it apart, that picture was behind the frame. It was inside that frame.
wow. Wow, what serendipity.
Right.
You chose to focus on a community that existed, as you said in the book, like shadows beyond the pines, largely unknown to white communities. And that title, Shadows Beyond the Pines, is so evocative. How did you arrive at that phrase, and what exactly does it mean to you?
Well, I actually started out calling my book number two, because I didn't, for the longest time, I didn't have a title for it. And I couldn't think of an appropriate title for it. Woodland Echoes, my first book, that title came almost right when I was getting ready to publish it, because um, my father was in the hospital. He had had a stroke, and luckily he came out of it unscathed. And so we were sitting there talking, and he said, your grandmother was going to name our cottage Woodland Echoes. What? You didn't tell me all this time. You didn't tell me that. So that was how that one came about. The shadows was, I was walking my dog, and I was looking at the trees along, the way, and I was thinking, boy, the trees here aren't like the trees in Michigan. The beautiful pines. And then I thought about how the white pines had been cut down during the lumber years. And I also thought about how people drive by on M37 and none of them know that that was back there. They didn't even know that at the time. And the people were living back there um, in the shadows, and not to come out into the light of racism. They were existing back there safe in that haven, protected by those pines. And that's when it hit me, shadows beyond the pines. So that's where that name came from.
Thank you so much for sharing that. When I caught it later on in the book, about halfway through, I said, "Oh, there's the title."
Yes.
So thank you so much for sharing that. Um, I'm curious, how does Woodland Park's story change the narrative we usually hear or don't hear about Black history in Michigan?
um so I have to say, a lot of the stories that I know about Michigan and how um, Blacks were treated, because I did a lot of research about it. And um, during the migration, blacks came to Michigan because, there was manufacturing going on. The cars were being manufactured. There were steel mills. There were things like that going on. And even before then, there was a lot of Quaker population in Michigan. Well, the Quakers had no fight against the blacks, so they accepted them. And when I think of some of the stories for my own family, um, my father's maternal family lived in Covert, Michigan. That was during the 1800s when people were coming back from the Civil War. They were living integrated long before integration ever happened, and probably that might have been a illegal thing back then, for them to live that way, but they didn't care. The black people worked alongside them. They went to school with them. They went to their churches. They owned property. Some of them were wealthier than a lot of the other white people. They were accepted as leaders in the community. So that was on my father's maternal side. On his father's side, I don't know if you've heard of the old settlers up in Remus. My great great grandfather Cross built a school. He built a church and a house on land that was given to him after he came out of the Civil War. Um, the church was built in 1869 by my grandfather. It still operates today. So I have really good stories that I know about Woodland Park. Sojourner Truth, she lived in Battle Creek. She was for the women's movement along with the black movement. These are great stories, and I try to listen to the more upbeat stories about what Michigan has done.
Mhm.
I hope that answered your question.
I think it answered it very well, and it really segues very well next into the questions I want to ask about these historical networks and connections you're talking about. And so, how did the Black resort communities like Woodland Park create spaces for Black professionals and activists to connect in ways that just really didn't seem as possible elsewhere?
I think with Woodland Park and maybe even with Idlewild, Idlewild opened the doors for Woodland Park, but I really believe it was Ella who made Woodland Park as well received as what it was because of her connections and her sister's connection. Her sister Myrtle had been big in the Black movement. She worked for the NAACP. She worked for the uh, women's rights. She worked alongside people like Hallie Q. Brown, W.E.B. Du Bois, a lot of people like that. Um, and Hallie and W.E.B. Du Bois, they were connected to Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a college. It's right up the road from where I live here in Cincinnati, and it was built for the black the masters of these plantations who had children with some of their slaves, but they wanted to have them educated. And so they started this college and they sent their children there to be educated. My grandmother went there, but a lot of the Wilberforce people, Hallie Q. Brown, she was a student, a teacher, and a dean there. Um, the bishops, they all went there. The first teacher for Woodland Park Elementary, he went there. And a lot of the Woodland Park students, they furthered their education in Wilberforce. So a lot of that networking, I think, brought people to Woodland Park and Idlewild. And one of the other big things was because of its proximity to Chicago. People that came in droves from Chicago because it's only like 3 or 4 hours drive. So, one of the cottages that was built early on down the road from our cottage was from the Murray brothers, the guy that made the pomade. He became a millionaire off of that. Black men's hair care that's still in business today, although he, sold it. And the day that he was coming to Woodland Park to retire to his cottage there, he told his wife he was tired after they packed up the car, and he sat down in the chair and died. So he never got to live there as a retiree.
Throughout your book, so many places kept coming up, like Chicago. So I think you sharing about more about these networks has been really helpful to hear.
Mhm.
I was wondering, throughout the book and just a moment ago, you talked about how Woodland Park was in some ways an integrated community, right? You talked
Mhm.
about the postmaster in the book and the sheriffs ended up being like Woodland Park Black residents for the area. And I also saw a little bit throughout the story as well. Your story included pretty fascinating examples of some of the white individuals who aligned themselves with the local Black community, and sometimes they faced consequences, or like in one of your notes they were counted as Black on the census because they were just there living, they were just living in this community, and
Right.
nobody cared to ask like who else lives here. What did you what how did you research those stories, and what did you find interesting about people living together in that way?
Well, okay, so you did talk about Frank and Sadie Coombs. They actually lived there in Woodland Park before Woodland Park started. So they were there they bought their property in 1918, and Woodland Park started in 1921. Well, Frank, he put up very racial signs once he found out about Woodland Park and deterred people from coming on his property. But I don't know that it was because he was the racist that he wanted to portray, or if it was because he was making his illegal liquor and he wanted to keep people off of his property to keep that secret safe. And because he had a lot of shady characters that came up there to get his whiskey and beer. Like it's rumored Al Capone was up there. It was also a fact that Dutch Anderson was there. And in fact, Dutch had just made a run there when he was shot down in Muskegon. And him and the police officer both died from that shootout. But I do want to talk about Willie B. Willie B came from a very wealthy family in Santa Barbara, California. And it isn't known how she met and married a Black bricklayer and then moved to the rural woods with him. But um, I sat down with a descendant who had a box full of papers shortly before I published the Shadows book. And we went through each piece of mail of this old box full of stuff. And we read all the letters, and we could piece through it that Willie B had been kicked out by her parents, and her siblings missed her, and they would write to her saying how they hoped she could return to them someday. And even in my own family, my Aunt Louise, who had been a co-owner of our cottage in the beginning until they built their own place next door, she had been white. And that was until she married my uncle Cecil. And then the census listed her as Black for the rest of her life. She gave up her white world and never looked back. There were a few mixed marriages. Anton Pillow was cheated out of his patent for a carburetor that may have made him a very wealthy man because he was married to a black woman living in Woodland Park. But the thing is, they felt safe there. No one threatened or ostracized them because of who they loved. So Woodland Park embraced all that.
Such a fascinating history. I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then I'll turn it over to our reader questions.
Okay.
And then just before we wrap up, I'll ask you some last questions just for folks to
Okay.
look ahead here. Um, I'm wondering, you published this book independently, much in the spirit of Woodland Park and its community.
Yeah.
When you mentioned when you started working on this book and a bit about what drove you to publish it. Um, so that's the first thing, you published independently, and you also chose to write it as a family by family narrative rather than maybe like a traditional historical textbook, as you might see sometimes.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
what drove that creative decision?
Well, I wrote it how the people told me the stories. Um, I gave voice to their voices and wrote it how I would want to read it. I didn't want it to sound like a textbook. Again, I'm not a scholar, but I am an avid reader and I know how I like to read a story. To me, it was like reading a love story, as hokey as that may sound. And bar all the mistakes made in my books, I think I was at least able to tell the story. Um, I there was virtually nothing in Google about Woodland Park when I first started. And I did uncover a picture, one of Ella's postcards posted in Flickr. Um, it was the lobby of the Royal Breeze Hotel. It was on there in Woodland Park, Michigan. And I'm like, wait, what? A hotel in Woodland Park? I was sure that was a mistake. There was an email address attached to it. So, still thinking it's some kind of mistake, I emailed the person, and now he's a great friend of mine. And he led me to Stephen Jones, Malcolm X's nephew. And he opened up a whole new world to me. He was like the Anne Sullivan to Helen Keller to me, you know. So, anyway, like I said, he died unexpectedly after maybe not even a whole year that I got to know him. And he was writing a book and it was never published. And a few months after that, I decided to take my family story to the next level. To begin my journey of research, I made many visits and phone calls and felt terrible that his story wasn't told. His family still may publish, but so far haven't. So I started gathering more and more information, and my focus expanded. So, somewhere along that ride, it became a matter of getting Woodland Park's story told. I started questioning my own mortality because of Stephen and that of my father's. He was getting older and had some scary hospital stays from time to time. So I was driven to get the book published and into his hands. Well, if you go traditional publisher, you have to research and find people, agents that's willing to accept your story. And even then, they have to like what they read, and then they have to sell it to a traditional publisher. I felt like I was running out of time, and um, I ended up deciding to self-publish. Funny thing is, I thought it would only be to family and friends who would want it. I mean, I don't have a background in writing, so it surprised me how far it reached and how many people from other states have reached out to me and asked me questions or even asked me to speak on it. Um, And if you're on a pontoon ride with me, I become the tour guide pointing out the places from the past. But I decided to self-publish and because of that, the timing. I didn't know my dad would live to be 95 and a half years old.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
Your independent publishing journey is very inspiring, and we'll ask a little question closer to the end about for folks who might be interested in their own publishing journey and collecting stories. But I just wanted to ask another question about what you wrote in the book. Um, you talked a little about the Green Book and how the Green Book listed several Woodland Park establishments as safe spaces for Black travelers. How did being included in that guide change the community?
Honestly, I think the Green Book was a great idea, and it was patterned after the Blue Book. The Blue Book was a Jewish book like that, where it would say safe places for Jewish people to stay. But as far as how it would have helped either Idlewild or Woodland Park, I don't think it did.
Mhm.
Um, because both places are so far north. Um, I would assume that initially when Idlewild was booked up, they would send people down to Woodland Park. Um, Woodland Park and Idlewild had buses and cabs that routed people back and forth. But again, because it was so far off the main road to anywhere, a person would have to either um, want to stay at either one of those places already. Uh, by that, I mean both Woodland Park and Idlewild aren't on the way to Chicago, Lansing, Battle Creek, Detroit, or any other main city where Black populations are. They had to be purposely going to either place. But the Green Book was a great idea for people to who visited any of those places. Um, but I don't know that it really helped Woodland Park or Idlewild because of the proximity of where they were.
Gotcha. That makes so much sense. I'm going to ask one more question here before I turn it over to reader questions.
Okay.
Many descendants still live in the Woodland Park area today. Can you tell us a little bit about this community now, and how do current residents connect with this history?
Oh my gosh, we have like the best um, descendants with like they told a lot of stories. But not only that, we're all now very good friends. We keep in communication with each other all year long. We tell each other happy birthday on a messenger and on text messages. You can always tell when somebody's having a birthday or an anniversary or something because you hear your phone go ping, ping, ping. um, all of us get together a lot and we talk about um, how relief fills us once we turn off of M37 and go back into Woodland Park. You leave all your troubles and things on the doorstep. You don't bring them in with you. Um, we meet haphazardly because somebody will say, "Hey, we're going to be over at Woody's tonight. Why don't you meet us down there?" Or you could be sitting on your beach in front of the cottage and a pontoon boat will come by and stop and pick you up and take you around the lake, because we're all intermingled now. We're all like a big family now. And I think um, Ella and Marion would be so proud of that. Um, so proud of how the descendants, spread the story so that it got to me so that I could put it in writing. And I think um, the younger people that are coming up now, they want to be there. Uh, Sometimes people have younger people and they're like, yeah, I don't want to go there. There's no internet. There's no this, no that. But young people are coming there. So unlike Idlewild, we don't have a gimmick, or we didn't have a gimmick of the entertainers and things like that that drew people in by the thousands into Idlewild. We only had the tranquility and the calmness and the peace of being on our lake or being in Woodland Park. We don't have the businesses. We have two now, maybe three, because I think there's a place for retirement people. But it's Woody's and the Shangri-La. If you want to come to Woodland Park, the Shangri-La has like 4 or 5 little cottages that you could stay in on their property. Um, but we don't have the hotels. We don't have all that kind of stuff. There's remnant hotels still there, a few, but most of the things from back in the heyday are gone. And I think that would sadden Marion and Ella, that especially that the Royal Breeze and the clubhouse that they prided themselves in are gone. But
Mhm.
I think overall our community is strong, um, and we're a tight community. I
Thank you
hope that
so much.
answered your question. I went kind of off track there, but
No, I think you're right on track. Um, we're gonna shift over now to reader questions. So thank you folks for dropping things in the chat. I'm gonna pick a few out that I think could be that we can talk a little bit about. Barbara asked, have your stories created many curious visitors to Woodland Park? And if so, how were they received? She's curious and maybe wants to visit, but wants to be respectful and not disturb residents.
oh, you wouldn't disturb us. um, Periodically, if you come there, you're lucky if the schoolhouse is open, because the schoolhouses now are kind of our historical venue where you can go in. I made up a bunch of displays, and most of them I made up for when I was first pushing my first book and having my book signings. I overdo things because I'm a hobbyist nightmare. So part of my thing was doing scrapbooking. So I had all this scrapbook paper and all this stuff. So I made up all these boards and put pictures on them and articles of old Woodland Parks um, historical information. So if you're lucky enough and the schoolhouse is open, you can come in there and see. There is an ice house that sits on the property. Back in the old days before refrigeration, people had ice houses. So you can actually see what an ice house looked like. And um, people are very welcoming, I think, in Woodland Park. If you stay at the Shangri-La, and I have to tell you about my friend Harvey, how I met him. I'm sitting on the beach, and this is before I had my own pontoon boat. And I'm sitting there like I'm usually with a book in hand, reading something. And he stops by on his pontoon and he said, "You want to go for a ride?" Well, it's not like somebody driving by you and saying, "You want to go for a ride?" There's no place to go but on the lake. So I said, "Sure." Well, Harvey and I have been tight friends ever since. I get a text message from him every single day, every morning. He sends me a text message. And I've been on a boat with him where he's done that with other people. And so it becomes the tour. So I point out all the places of interest, what used to be there. So if you happen to stay at the Shangri-La, because we pick people up there too, and Harvey goes by on his pontoon, he'll pick you up and take you for a ride. So visitors are very welcome.
I love to hear that. Keep an eye out for Harvey if you stumble into the
You're
Woodland Park
right.
area. Wonderful. Okay, we have time for one or two more reader questions. So I'll ask the question that came from Marianne. Can you account for why everybody seems to know of Idlewild, but not so much about Woodland Park? Since reading the book, he's been informing many longtime Michigan residents about Woodland Park who've never heard of it. And he actually vacationed in Idlewild in the 40s and 50s and didn't even know about Woodland Park. So, what's the discrepancy there?
Idlewild, again, they had the gimmick. They had the entertainers. My dad even saw Count Basie in Idlewild. So they had the gimmick that brought people in. And when you have something that's bigger than life like that, think of having Beyonce come to your your little town. That's big. That's huge. And they had lots of those people come. But Woodland Park, our founders didn't want that. In fact, they said, if if you want to come to Woodland Park and stay, you're more than welcome. Just don't entertain. We don't want entertainers entertaining. They did have from time to time, because they were society type people. Remember, Ella came from a very wealthy family, so she had that kind of idea. She wanted society people at first coming to Woodland Park. And when Idlewild started, it was in 1915. When Woodland Park started, it was 1921. Prohibition was during that time. So we had no alcoholic beverages in the park originally. And really, we didn't start Woody's Bar and Grill. Um, it was the Bluebell until after the authors had died. So I think um, it was irritating to me, if I, to be frank, that Idlewild hardly ever spoke about Woodland Park, but a lot of their workforce were people from Woodland Park.
Mm,
A lot of their customers came from Woodland Park because when they wanted to go and party and see these different entertainers, there was a bus or a cab or something that would take them to Idlewild and then bring them back to the tranquility of Woodland Park. So I wanted to change that. And that was another reason why I wrote my two books about Woodland Park. I wanted people to know that.
thank you so much. We have one last question from the audience. If you have a rapid fire response here.
Okay.
Sharon said you talk about postcards. Can you talk about the postcards that were taken of the resort, but mostly were they sold and sent out? Those postcards you found, how did those find people?
If you go on the internet and you Google Woodland Park, or you Google Bitely, because we're kind of interchangeable. Bitely is the white community north of Woodland Park back in the day, but we shared their post office. So when our post office went away, we shared theirs. So a lot of the Woodland Park is known as Bitely as well. But those postcards will pop up, the images. There was a guy that lived in or had property in Bitely, a white gentleman from Detroit, and he collected Woodland Park postcards. And he had a big, vast collection of them. And so that's where I found a lot of them. And then along the line, when people knew I was writing, they gave me postcards, or they sent me emails of postcards. So that's how these postcards came out for me.
Mhm.
I hope that answered their question.
I think it was very helpful. Before
Okay,
we wrap up, I just wanted to ask just one or two more questions on our
sure.
end. Um, for people who are interested in exploring the subject more in depth, do you have any other book recommendations or areas that they should be looking to or reading to learn more about Woodland Park or Black Resort communities?
Well, um, I my first book is Woodland Echoes. That's a real thick book, and that was the one that it has a lot about the area. It talks a lot about Idlewild and but mostly my focus was that area and Woodland Park and how the communities, the surrounding communities all intermingled. And even kind of historical things like, my I told about my father riding his bike on the handlebars. He used to ride backwards with the handle on the handlebars, and one of the neighbors called out to him that FDR had died. Things along that line that I felt were kind of impactful during that time period. So if you're interested in Woodland Park, more about Woodland Park, read my first book. Excuse the errors, excuse the typos and things like that, but there's that. I also wrote a cozy murder mystery that kind of represents being located in a resort that used to be a black resort during segregation, but it's totally mythical. But it's a cozy murder mystery, so there is some chuckles in it.
Thank you so much for that. And
Sure.
my very rapid fire last question.
Yes.
For readers who might be inspired to research hidden histories in their own communities, give them one piece of advice.
Talk to the older people. They are a wealth of knowledge. Go to the historical societies. Um, Google every kind of name you can come up for that area. Um, uh,
It
talk.
but it's very hard to dig out.
Oh,
What
sorry about that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're all good.
Oh, okay. Yes, just reach out. And if somebody tells you, you should go talk to this person, go talk to them because there's some reason why they sent you to them.
That is such a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Diana, for your time today.
I
And
do I do want to say you can always email me
yes,
if you want to ask me any questions.
I'll be sending a follow-up email to folks who registered for the event as well as our members, and I'll be sure to include your contact information so that people
Thank
can
you.
reach out. Thank you to everybody who tuned in today for this discussion. We will be posting this discussion on Bridge Michigan's website and our YouTube channel this week. And you can also view this video, the recording video, on our as well. Um, Culture Club events are held every other month, and our next one will be in August this year. So please do keep an eye on your inbox for a post event survey where we'll ask for your suggestions for books, films, podcasts for us to consider for the rest of the events this year. And if you'd like to receive our next Culture Club selection, consider becoming a Bridge Club member today. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day. Bye all.